The Zong was a British slave ship that left the coast of Africa in 1781 with about 440 slaves, twice the number it was built to carry. Months later, it would arrive in Jamaica with just over 200 slaves. But the events that ensued on that journey made my stomach churn. A court case motivated by greed was how the public came to learn of more than 100 of the enslaved people on board the Zong being thrown overboard alive on the journey to Jamaica. First, it was a time when all these colonizing countries were at war with each other. The British, the French, the Dutch, and lately the North Americans were stealing each other's ships and the cargo on board. And so it was that the Zorgue, a Dutch vessel, was captured by the British and held with a cargo of more than 200 slaves. Now, as the Zorgue was being held on the African coast with its precious cargo of slaves, the British vessel, the William, sailed in from Liverpool with Captain Richard Hanley. When Hanley saw the ship with a cargo full of slaves, he thought this was too good of an opportunity to pass up. So he contacted his ship's owner, William Gregson. Gregson himself was a man born of humble means, but he managed to amass great wealth from the slave trading business. Gregson's ships made about 150 slave voyages from the African coast to the Americas. On these trips, he brought nearly 60,000 slaves to the Americas, and about 25,000 of these landed in Jamaica. So, of course, when Hanley told him that there was a ship full of slaves ready to sail, he couldn't pass it up, and he gave Hanley permission to purchase the ship. And so it was that the Zorgue was renamed the Zong. Now, one of the first things Gregson did when he acquired the ship was take out insurance of £30 a head for each slave on board. And had he not done that, we probably would never have known about the horrific massacre that took place on the Zong. So now Hanley needed a captain for the Zong because he had sailed in on the William. So he promoted his ship's surgeon, which wasn't really a surgeon. It was just somebody that they brought on the ship just to check the slaves and make sure that they were, alive for the journey. So the surgeon Luke Collingwood was never a ship's captain, but he was now given this task to captain the Zong on its journey to the Caribbean. Hanley also instructed his new captain to not set sail for the Americas just yet, but to try to pick up some more slaves for the journey. And so it wasn't until another 5 months that the ship finally left the African coast with 442 African slaves, having picked up some more from Ghana. An experienced slave captain would know how much food and water and all the supplies that they would need for the number of people on board. And a wise ship captain would have brought twice the amount that was needed. But Collingwood was neither of those things, and the crew that was hastily put together didn't have enough experience to make the necessary checks to ensure that they had enough provisions. Normally, it would be the ship's first mate who would check the supplies. And on the Zong, this person was James Kelsall. But even though the ship made a stop in Sao Tome, it's not clear whether or not these checks were actually done to ensure that they had enough supplies. By this time, it's estimated that the first set of slaves who were on the Zong had been on the ship for up to a year because they had been captured. They were held on board for several months when the ship had been captured in port. It was held a further 5 months while they tried to trade for more slaves. And then they stopped in Sao Tome for several weeks. So on the 6th of September, the ship finally left from Sao Tome, headed for Black River in Jamaica. On board was a voluntary passenger, Robert Stubbs, who was a former ship's captain but hadn't sailed a ship in 30 years. At some point during the journey, the captain, Collingwood, fell ill, and apparently he was so sick that he was unable to command the ship. But what Collingwood would go on to do was appoint the passenger who had been a ship's captain 30 years earlier to captain the ship, passing up the first mate, James Kelsall. Now, Kelsall was upset about it because he must have been saying to himself, after this man no more than me. So, of course, he made a ruckus, and to discipline him, he was suspended from his post as the first mate. Somewhere around November 18 or 19, they sighted landfall thought to be Tobago. This was around 10 weeks after they had first left Sao Tome, and normally it would have been a good time to make a stop and kind of replenish their provisions. But remember, these colonies were at war, and they were unsure of whether or not this was friendly territory. Were they going to land and be attacked by either the French or the Dutch? They didn't know, so they decided to pass up a stop in Tobago. All this time, people are dying on the ship, because remember that these were really treacherous journeys for everyone, especially the enslaved people on board. 62 of them died, and several other crew members died as well. With Kelsall on suspension, nobody was really in charge of checking the supplies. The journey from Tobago to Jamaica would normally last 10 days, so they weren't really worried about having adequate provisions. Somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, one of the crew members noticed that one water container was leaking badly. So they checked the remaining water supplies and concluded that they had enough for everyone on board for about 13 days on full ration. Somewhere around November 27 or 28, the Zong finally sighted Jamaica. However, due to a navigational error, they thought that it was Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, which was then controlled by the French. And not wanting to make landfall on enemy territory, they set sail west. With water supplies diminishing and aided by strong winds, the ship rapidly sailed past Jamaica. By the time they realized the error, they were 120 miles away. Now, by this time, too many things were happening, and out of desperation, they had to reinstate Kelsall to the first mate position. But now it was estimated that the ship only had 4 days worth of water for everyone on board, and it would take between 10 and 14 days to head back to Jamaica. By this time, of the 442 slaves who were on board when they left the African coast, only 380 remained, and many of them were sick. Being close to port, this would have been the time when they would take out the slaves, clean them up, oil them up, and make them look, presentable for trading. But being short-staffed and having so many problems with supplies, they didn't even have time to do that. And so it was that on November 29th, with water supplies diminishing, the crew came together and decided how to fix their problem. I quote, "Part of the slaves should be destroyed to save the rest, and the remainder of the slaves and the crew put to short allowance." Not a single member of the crew objected to the suggestion that they kill some of the slaves, and by nightfall, they began their gruesome acts. At 8 o'clock that evening, 54 women and children were pushed overboard. 2 days later, on December 1st, 42 men were thrown overboard. A third batch of about 38 African slaves were killed sometime later, and around 10 Africans who realized what was happening jumped overboard to their deaths. Some reports suggest that up to 150 Africans lost their lives in this massacre, but the later court case would decide on the figure of 122. Even more slaves died on the journey to Jamaica, and by the time they sailed into Black River, about 30 Africans lay dead on the deck from thirst and famine. The Zong had set sail on September 6 with 442 enslaved Africans. When they arrived in Jamaica on December 22nd, only 208 slaves remained. Now, this would have been the end of the story if the ship's owners, William Gregson and company, were not interested in making a profit from the cargo that they had lost. The slave traders were motivated by one thing: greed. They wanted money for the slaves who had been killed on their ships. So they made a claim with the insurance company, but the insurance company denied the claim. So then Gregson sued the insurance company, and the case was tried in March of 1783. During the trial, Kelsall and Stubbs pointed fingers at each other. The ship's captain, who had been ill, Collingwood, died shortly after the ship arrived in Jamaica, so he wasn't there to testify. But Stubbs claimed that he was only a passenger on the ship and he wasn't really in charge. You know, Kelsall said, look, I am only just the ship's mate. I wasn't in charge either. So nobody wanted to claim responsibility. But had this case not been filed, none of this information would have come to light. At first, the judge ruled in favor of the ship's owners, but the insurance company appealed on the basis that there were serious errors in navigation and general mismanagement of the vessel that led to the massacre in the first place. A retrial was ordered, but that second trial never took place, and Gregson actually didn't get any compensation from this case. But those opposed to the slave trade would use the horrors of the Zong Massacre to boost their case for abolition.